Good afternoon, and welcome to this American Enterprise Institute book event. There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. My name is Brent Orrell, and I'm a senior fellow at AEI, where my work focuses on job training and workforce development as pathways for social and economic mobility. For those of you unfamiliar with AEI, we are a nonprofit public policy think tank dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of our scholars and staff advances ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. Our guest today is Dr. Fiona Hill of the Brookings Institution. From her position as the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe, Dr. Hill also seeks to promote a stable, prosperous, democratic world that seeks to help every American and people around the world maximize their personal potential and strengthen the communities and countries they live in. Her life is, in a way, a case study in these principles. Growing up a coal miner's daughter in the Rust Belt of Northern England, she rose by dint of hard work and perseverance against economic, class, gender, and cultural barriers to become a leading expert on Russia and U.S. foreign policy. As a daughter of the working class, she's also acutely aware of how the deck can be stacked against those who come from the quote-unquote wrong social and economic backgrounds, and how persistent systemic disadvantage can erode democratic societies from within and weaken them abroad. Prior to her current post at Brookings, Dr. Hill served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She holds a master's degree in Soviet Studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also holds a master's in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The book Dr. Hill and our other panelists will discuss today, There's Nothing for You Here, makes a very provocative argument. Far from being politically and geographically distant and historically and culturally distinct societies, the United States, the UK, and Russia share certain important challenges in common. Persistent economic and social disadvantages embedded in all three countries, she says, has made each vulnerable to the populist impulse that has swept much of the developed world over the past decade. To mitigate and reverse these threats to democratic institutions, human liberty, and social and economic progress, she says, we must acknowledge these challenges and begin working to fix them. Joining us for today's conversation are AEI scholars Kori Schake and Michael Strain. Dr. Schake is a senior fellow and the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI. Before joining AEI, Dr. Schake was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's had a distinguished career in government, working at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She has also taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, National Defense University, and the University of Maryland. Michael Strain is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at AEI, where he oversees work on economic policy, financial markets, international trade and finance, tax and budget policy, welfare economics, healthcare policy, and related areas. He is the author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Before joining AEI, Dr. Strain worked in the Center for Economic Studies at the U.S. Census Bureau and in the Macroeconomics Research Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Today's event is intended to be conversational. I'm going to pose an opening question to Fiona that will facilitate a review of the overarching themes of her book. When she's done, We'll be turning to Kori for some questions related to the book's analysis of American foreign policy challenges, particularly as they relate to Russia and China, a very timely topic. And then to Michael for his response to the book's analysis of the trajectory of the US economy, as well as opportunities for economic mobility. Finally, we'll turn to some of Dr. Hill's policy prescriptions for fixing what's wrong. Our session will close out with questions from our virtual audiences, which can be submitted at any time during the conversation on Twitter at #FionaHill@AEI or by email Jesse Wall at aei.org. That's Jesse, Jessie, .wall, WALL, at aei.org. So Fiona, thank you again for making time to do this. And thank you, Kori and Michael, for also taking time out of very crowded schedules. I really appreciate all of you being here. Your book, Fiona, is organized around 4 key themes. Your personal story, which sort of runs throughout the book and helps to illuminate a lot of the questions that you're addressing. The comparative geopolitics of Russia, the US, and the United Kingdom, an analysis of macroeconomic trends in the US, and your policy proposals for improving upward mobility. I'd like you to take a few minutes to outline each of these and how you see them fitting together.
Well, thanks so much for having me for this, Brent. And I'm just delighted to be with Kori and Michael. And it's a great honor. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and also delighted that we'll have other people joining us from the AI community. As I was saying before we started, it's a great shame as Brookings and AI are right next door to each other on Massachusetts Avenue that we're all probably sitting somehow completely remotely. But hopefully we'll be back at some point to be able to have those kinds of personal interactions. And I'll start, first of all, with the personal. Why did I, use my personal story as a thread through the book? That was a little bit of a risk, I have to say, particularly as somebody who's a scholar and a policy analyst. I was actually initially, as I set out to do the book, trying to do it more thematically on the other issues that you'd raised and laid out there, and actually found that it was extraordinarily difficult to do it. I'd been wanting to use some of my own personal backstory of growing up in relative poverty in the north of England at the time of massive dislocation, with the changeover from heavy nationalised industry in the UK to the private privatisation under Margaret Thatcher, and how to sort of explain that using some of the backstories vignettes. But in fact, when I did try it thematically, it didn't work very well. So I had to go back to the drawing board and ended up using my own story. Really, the chronology is kind of like the spine of the story, more than anything else. But as you rightly point out, there are different themes in there. And, I want to say, first of all, that I probably started off from a very different perspective than from most people at looking at things. So I start off as the daughter of a coal miner. So I do see things through a very different lens. I grew up beginning in the 1960s in the United Kingdom at a time when the coal industry was already, basically no longer competitive. As I'd mentioned, just in passing there, most of the industry in the part of the UK that I'd grown up with was nationalised, which is something that hasn't happened in the United States. And I do want to say there's a distinction here, which I think Michael will pick up on, that the United States comes from a very different perspective on some of these issues, but there is some overlap, which I'll just try to explain very quickly. So at the end of World War II, when Britain came out of the devastation of the war economically, it had been cut off for many years from the global economy and regional economies. And basically the owners of the private sector did not have the wherewithal of rebuilding the industry back in. So the government stepped up. And the whole period after World War II in the United Kingdom becomes a period of not just this kind of innovation, weird way of thinking about it, innovation in nationalised industry of all of the heavy industrial sectors, the steelworks, the shipyards, oil and gas, railways, coal mines, you name it, but also a period of trying to provide new national level institutions for getting the population back on their feet as well. So the creation of the National Health Service and the creation of other parts of the welfare system. And again, I want to go back to the origins of the word of welfare as well, because in the UK now there's a whole debate about well-being. Well-being and welfare are pretty much part of exactly the same coin. I think, in the West now, in the United States and the UK, we've got a different idea of what welfare means. It kind of gives people the sort of sense that this means people living off the state. But that initial idea of welfare was to give people a hand up again and to help them get back on their feet after a period of massive devastation. And it's really the kind of sense of welfare that was that's enshrined in the preamble to the US Constitution, talking about the general welfare of the population. So the whole idea after World War II was not to kind of make everybody somehow subservient to the state, but was to actually give people a hand up after the devastation of World War II. Now, of course, as we well know from the economic history, that state-owned enterprises are notoriously inefficient. There was an awful lot of problems then of transforming these heavy industries. And in the 1980s, so by the time I reached my teenage years and my early adulthood, moving on to the rest of my life and career, Margaret Thatcher had come in 1979 and was determined to turn around the whole British economy. This is the whole period of massive change in manufacturing, including in the United States and in all the other advanced industrial economies. And Margaret Thatcher wanted to end this period of nationalisation, the subsidisation, which was dragging down the British economy, and also to try to put everything on a different footing, more automation, modernisation, etc. What happened, however, in somewhere like the north of England, is every single industry there was nationalised, which is very different from other parts of the country, particularly the south and around London, where you had more of innovation, more an entrepreneurship. Pretty much everybody I knew worked in heavy industry. And so you had a period in the 1980s of just mass layoffs with the privatisation. And it's really that kind of theme that I'm focusing on the book. It's not the transformation of the macro economy or the country overall, because the United Kingdom became extraordinarily competitive as a result of the privatisation, Margaret Thatcher, and some of the reforms. But what happened was very distinct geographic areas which were associated with specific kind of industries got completely left behind, because the northeast of England was, in many respects, it wasn't centrally planned, but it was a heavy industry, state-run economy. And so when privatisation came in, you got a massive transformation and dislocation, hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs all at once as major industries were closed down. Now, experiencing all of that for myself, when I first went to the Soviet Union, I started studying Russian, and Kori and I are going to probably talk about this against the backdrop of the war scare of the 1980s, which is another phenomenon that was going on. And we're back in that again now with Vladimir Putin threatening war with Ukraine and potentially even escalating that to different dimensions. When I first went to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I saw again a massive heavy industry-based, obviously entirely state-run economy that was also, like I'd experienced in the UK, on its last legs, running out of any kind of entrepreneurial spirit that it may or may not have ever had, no longer competitive on global markets, and something radical needing to be done. And of course, we saw Mikhail Gorbachev trying to tinker with this, which didn't work. And then in the 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, we saw an attempt to do what had been done under Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and to some degree, in the United States, with the transformation of the massive manufacturing base into something new, more innovative, more based on modernization and automation. And basically, I witnessed, for myself, the same dynamic that happened in the north of England happening in Russia at the end of the Soviet Union, with the same mass dislocation, the changes in the industry resulting with hundreds of thousands and millions of people losing their work, and no ability for them to, this gets into your bailiwick, Brent, retrain and basically prepare themselves for a transition to something else. And in the United States context, what I'm trying to sort of posit in the book is that a similar kind of phenomenon happened in certain sectors in certain parts of the United States. I mean, Michael's, the title of his book, The American Dream Isn't Dead, I completely agree with. And I think on a much larger scale in the United States was also a pretty successful transformation in the 1980s. But, what we now call the Rust Belt didn't used to be the Rust Belt. It was the heartland, the manufacturing sector, massively built up after World War II, obviously not nationalized, but mass manufacturing, heavily invested in, cities and towns built around, the auto plant or the massive steelworks, depending on the place we're talking about. And then, with changes in the economy, so much of an investment in those kinds of large-scale heavy industries, it was very difficult to transform into something else. And what's also very striking about the mass manufacturing and the heavy industry in the United States, if we start to think about it, because of the way that benefits developed in the US, including healthcare benefits, they were also tied to the workplace. So in a way, the people who lost those jobs had become or have been shackled to the workplace because of their inability to move on and look for other things because of the healthcare under the system, which bizarrely is the same thing you see in the Soviet Union. Healthcare wasn't just on a national basis like it is in the United Kingdom. It was tied to the workplace, and the clinics and the hospitals and the healthcare were tied to the particular enterprise. So there was a whole host of things that actually these three economies in particular had in common. And what I talk about in the book is the way that those dynamics of the sudden dislocation, the shifts in the economy really affected some places more than others. And if you see the rise of Putin in Russia, his base of support comes out of the old industrial cities, the places where there were all the workers who find themselves really in a completely different place as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, feeling a sense of loss, not just of the loss of the larger state that he talks about a great deal, but the loss of the workplace, the identity and the culture that grew up among that. And so, as I move on through the book and talk about the politics of what happens in the United States, of populism, making clear that populism can happen both on the left and on the right. I mean, I've experienced both. And initially in the north of England, that there was a populist upsurge on the left with, some kind of extremes of positions in that period in the 1980s. Now we've switched over to sort of a populism on the right over the course of several decades. And the Russian case, you've gone from the left to the right as well. I mean, again, it's the populist position that Michael talks about. We can talk about this later. Can manifest itself in different forms, but in the nature of the politics, Putin basically is telling his larger constituency that he will fix everything, put everything back, restore their dignity, their sense of identity, bring jobs back, and then the whole idea of making Russia great again. So there's actually some similar strains in the politics in all three countries that could become rooted in this transformation, this deindustrialization of these places that have been dominated by heavy industry. And what was missing in all of the cases was, in fact, that idea of how to prepare people for different workplaces. And I talk in the book about some of the things that were missed at different points. And then the very end of the book and some of the pronouncements are talking through really, and again we can talk about this more, some of the things that you all work on as well about how one might tackle this. And I don't actually advocate that the government should be doing this. I mean, one of the things that I think has really struck a lot of Europeans when they read the book is that, they thought I was going to end with a whole series of the government should do this, the government should do that. But in actual fact, I end with, ways in which individuals can play a much larger role in addressing some of the problems here, the lack of opportunity and breaking down many of the barriers that have prevented people from moving forward and trying to reach their potential and find themselves new places of work or revitalizing the communities that got left behind. Anyway, I've gone through this extraordinarily quickly, but I mean, I'd really like to benefit from this discussion with all of you as well, because I mean, this is exactly why I wrote the book, actually. I mean, I start off as a Russia expert and people are like scratching their heads about, why did I write this book? Because, my whole career, I've seen these parallels and, I've actually written about this in the Russian context, and then seeing some of the same politics and the same dynamics play out, of course, in the UK and the United States has been somewhat jarring. But I wrote it especially to provoke a debate about what we can do to get ourselves out of the dilemma that we find ourselves in right now.
Well, when I read your book, Fiona, I was, like I said, I think this is a very provocative argument that you're making. And I really want us to get into each sort of those major themes. I'll probably get to your story a little bit at the end. But for now, we want to start off just by starting at the highest level of the discussion, which is kind of the geopolitics of this and some of the parallels that you're drawing. And I remember I went and saw Kori about this, and she was instantly eager to engage and discuss this topic. And so you write, Fiona, in your book, the ideological veil of the bitter struggle between capitalism and communism had concealed the fact that the United Kingdom, the USSR, and the United States had much in common. This is really a provocative statement. Americans, I think, in general, would have a very hard time conceiving of themselves as having anything in common with the history and political culture of Russia. So I think you've covered some of it, but if you've got anything, if you want to expand on that at all, and then we'll turn it over to Kori to react, to respond to that.
I will expand on it a bit, because look, if you come in from the top, you'll never see it. As I say, I came in from the bottom. So I actually, the first time I went to the Soviet Union in 1987, I went on a student exchange. So it's all the Soviet Union. So remember, it's still, that great big country of workers and peasants in theory, and smokestack industries. Mm-hmm. As soon as I got there, I thought, oh my God, this is just the north of England. And, I was the child by then of an ex-coal miner. I was immediately embraced by, people who were doing their own course of upward mobility through education, who were one step away from a coal mine or a collective farm. And I was immediately struck by also the decay of the Soviet Union. I mean, I'd been panicking like everybody else had about the prospect of nuclear Armageddon, the Euro missile crisis in the 1980s. I arrived there just as the INF treaties being signed by Gorbachev and Reagan in October of 1987, which brings to an end 10 years of incredible tension and multiple scares about the prospect of a nuclear exchange. And I got there and I thought, wow, this is the nuclear superpower. I mean, the place was falling apart, which is just the same as my hometown. And, as I describe in the book, my grandparents' mining village. And I was shocked by how primitive, things were, the lack of things in the shops. There weren't much in my shops in my neck of the woods either, but that was because people had no money. I mean, in Russia, there was pent-up demand. But there was no supply because of central planning. So, I mean, I saw the differences. But the structure of the place, coming from somewhere that was also dominated by nationalized heavy industry, was immediately apparent. And then when I got to Harvard in 1989, not long after this, I get the scholarship to go to Harvard University. Obviously, Harvard Yard and Cambridge, is one thing. But all I had to do was step outside and walk, less than a mile. From Harvard Yard into Somerville and to, parts of the places around Cambridge and in Boston that were going through their own industrial transformation, and seeing people who'd lost their jobs, the end of the brickworks or the meat packing plants or the auto plants. And, kind of parts of Boston were really, down on their luck as well. I mean, they will transform, in a few years from that. But I was sort of seeing this at this period where the bottom was coming out of manufacturing, also in Massachusetts. I would do some strange things. So my granddad used to race greyhounds. I would go on the T in Boston to the greyhound track just to kind of see it, just out of sort of nostalgia. And this place called Wonderland, anything but in Boston. And it was just the decay, the urban decay, the deindustrialization was extremely apparent. And I think if you start from a different perspective, as I said, you see different things. If you're looking at the superstructure of the state and the politics and the way things are set out, you see something quite different. But you see this kind of industrial dynamics and the kind of like dynamics of workers and others. You can see something, and those frustrations really building up. There was organized labor in the Soviet Union. It just was hidden behind the scenes. And, I'd actually got some funding to study Russian that had been given to the miners of County Durham during the miners' strike of 1984, 1985, raised by none other than the miners of the Donbass, which is particularly acute and poignant given, where we are right now in, the standoff with Russia and Ukraine. So there were all kinds of different threads that I saw there, which gave me a different perspective and perhaps a different understanding at a different level of what was kind of going on in these dynamics. Oh, Brent, I think we've lost your...
You're muted, Brent.
Yeah.
Never
It gets
fails.
every time, doesn't it? No matter how many times we do it. I know. I do it all the time.
Well, yeah, hundreds of people watching, I'm sure, and I've just completely botched my entrance there. But Kori, I wanted you to respond to that. What So we have what Fiona has laid out here is sort of a similarity in circumstances, but those circumstances are kind of overlaid by completely different systems, and so the response is different. What do you make of her argument around this?
So I have enormous admiration for her perspective. And I do think that the bottom-up perspective is actually the right way to understand cultural similarities. I hate the conversation about American exceptionalism. For me, it feels like the last redoubt of political idiocy. And so I always try and avoid it. What feels different to me, though, about the three cultures, and I am not a Russia expert, so I stand to be corrected by Fiona, but the one thing that feels genuinely culturally different for me about the United States versus Russia and the UK is risk tolerance.
Yeah.
I mean, that one of my favorite descriptions of Americans comes from a British historian in 1923, Bertha Ann Reuter, who writes that Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace anywhere else. And so one of the ways that populism feels different in the United States for me is that this is the roiling sea of liberty that Jefferson talks about. This is that Andrew Jackson's frontiersmen taking over from the founding fathers and redefining the nature of elites. It's, the way that American culture in the 1950s becomes so almost willfully innocent because you have so many young Americans traumatized by war service in their late teens and early 20s. And so the malleability of American culture, the other thing that I think is partly true of Britain, but not nearly to the same extent, is just how much immigrants define American culture. And the culture is itself open to redefinition, right? The lifeblood of American political culture is people choosing to leave someplace else, as Fiona did, coming here for opportunity, and the culture's celebration of that success, which I think is not quite the same in Britain and is absolutely not the same in the Soviet Union. So the drivers of political culture are different. The structure obviously matters. I'm sorry, one last point about the culture. If you haven't read Langston Hughes' memoir of his time in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, I find it profoundly moving because his expectation as a Black American lacking political and civic rights and going to the Soviet Union in the expectation that because the ideology was doctrinally more embracing, that as an African American, he would feel more at home there, and being really surprised at the extent to which he did not. It sort of gets at that sense of openness to redefining the culture, which is, I think, politically our saving grace. And the structural element that feels different for me is that the American political system is designed to be leashed on a very short leash to American public attitudes. And that makes our politics a lot more tumultuous. Any idiot can get elected president and very often does. Parties have such limited ability to control the entrepreneurialism of individual politicians. The president's main responsibility is delivering congressional support for her or his political agenda. And members of Congress have, as we learned yet again this year, have very limited interests in supporting the leading politician of their party because they are more beholden to their constituents and on a tighter time frame than they are beholden to the leadership. And that creates a government in waiting in the United States that you don't actually, I think, have to the same extent even in Britain, because so few people sweep into power with a new government. Whereas in the US, everybody has an incentive to be a critic of the administration, and the administration can choose whoever they want to come in with them in enormous numbers. So I think there is a greater expectation in the American political system that you can create change. And a lot of the populism that I think we're seeing in the US is the populism of, I demand that you take my opinion and make it policy, no matter how ignorant my opinion is. So those pieces of it feel different to me in ways that produce different risk tolerance and different ability to shape political outcomes.
Fiona, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but at first I want to ask Mike if he's got anything that he wants to add to this part of the conversation so far.
Not about Fiona's excellent observations about some areas being left behind, but instead, Brent, just so I understand the question about this discussion of the United States, Russia, and Great Britain that Kori and Fiona have been discussing.
I'm sorry, Mike. I didn't quite get what you were saying.
What would you like me to?
I'm just wondering if there's anything that you would like to expand on that Kori said, or want to respond to directly so far in what Fiona has said.
No, except to say that when we get to the economic component, my answer is going to be surprisingly similar to Kori's about risk tolerance and dynamism in the United States and the kind of unique ability of the United States to turn on a dime and change.
Okay, we don't want you to give away all your best material right now, so we'll let Fiona respond.
I was just struck by the similarity.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'm very excited by these comments because, again, the spirit of the book was to try to spur, change here by warning of some of the things that could happen if we weren't careful, or if we didn't return back to, some of that tolerance for risk, and kind of thinking about how to play to our strengths. So, I mean, the parallels that I draw are those that I was trying to lay out there as cautionary tales. In large part, the risks of leaving people behind because of, the nature of sort of structural change. We're about to do that again. I mean, we had this massive change, from the 1980s, 1990s in our, economic profile away from the large scale mass manufacturing, obviously through innovation and, from the very kind of things that AI and others have been espousing, on that macro level. It's really kind of a question of the places that didn't manage to adapt quite so quickly. And, what can we do to kind of bring them along? Because if we do think about, some of the features of our, our elections, I mean, the more arcane features of the US electoral system, the electoral college and the fact that, kind of in 2016, the vote was decided by 70,000 votes in 3 counties and 3 states. And those were all in counties and states that had been very hard hit by the industrial transformation of those earlier periods, just like the place in the north of England where there was a sort of shift in politics that was really kind of reflecting frustrations and grievances rather than in kind of people's own prospects or hopes and potential, which was kind of seems somewhat out of sync there, and that is really the point to try to get across here, because again, obviously in Russia, total stifling of any of the issues that we've been talking about here. The drivers are completely different. Some of the history and some of the structures are very similar between the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, actually, which is quite sort of striking in the history and some of the regional differences and historical differences. But it's really the way that Putin and others, have played directly to the crowd of the people from the state sector, so that in Russia the state sector remains enormous, although there was the privatization of the larger industrial sectors. Some last portion, I mean, almost 60% of the workforce either work for the state or in a state-owned enterprise. So we haven't seen the complete shift. And where we have, we've obviously seen it to individuals, rather than enterprises and private companies who are closely associated with the Kremlin. So the crony capitalism, the kleptocracy that we've seen emerge there. And of course, Kori, as you're pointing out, I mean, in Russia, there wasn't the rule of law entrenched in the same way, including in the private sector. We didn't really have any kind of history of private enterprise, very different from the United States and the United Kingdom. But, the feudalism of the past in the UK and in the Soviet Union is really quite striking. And of course, we've had slavery in the United States, which has created a drag too on our longer term economic development. So there are some parallels that I didn't get quite into in the book. I shaped some things out, but the whole point was to push in the direction that you were there, Zach. How does the United States really kind of reclaim that dynamism, that risk tolerance, which isn't there in the United Kingdom and in the United States to the same extent? So I completely agree with the points that you're bringing out there.
Okay, so let's shift then to the economics, the specific economic questions, and see, your book, Fiona, came out post outbreak of the pandemic.
That's right.
Michael's was published before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But you wrote in your book, Fiona, the only people thriving during the pandemic were billionaires. The rich got richer, the middle class poorer. The pandemic accelerated inequalities that technological change was already exacerbating. So, Mike, what do you make of that? I know that the pandemic is a short window in which to try to judge the performance of the U.S. economy or its impact or impact of current trends. But what do you make of the underlying argument that we already had these significant and growing inequalities and that trajectory has sped up, that limits opportunity, limits growth, limits socioeconomic mobility?
Yeah, I don't see that in the pandemic. I think, in fact, we see the opposite. Wages at the bottom of the distribution are rising faster than wages at the top. That's especially true if you account for inflation. If you want to look at inflation-adjusted wages, so people at the top are doing the worst because they have the slowest wage growth. People at the bottom are actually doing the best. If you look at the industries and the sectors of the United States that are seeing the most rapid increases in wages, they're lower wage sectors. Wages are growing for the economy as a whole at, say, 5 or 6% annual rate. Wages in the leisure and hospitality sector are growing at 12, 13, 14% annual rates, so more than twice the growth in the average. This is, not because coming out of a pandemic, low-wage workers are somehow better suited to that environment. Instead, I think it mostly reflects the fact that lower wage workers are more sensitive to the business cycle in both directions. And so during the 2008 financial crisis and Great Recession, you saw workers at the bottom getting hit really hard, much harder than workers at the top. That, I think, fueled a lot of the populism in the United States on both the left and the right that followed. But in the final years of the expansion, following the Great Recession and the final years before the pandemic, it was actually workers at the bottom who were doing the best in the U.S. economy. Similarly, when the pandemic hit and the economy was on the way down, workers at the bottom were hit much harder than workers at the top. Now that the economy's back on the way up, workers at the bottom are benefiting relatively more. And so when you kind of look overall at this pandemic period, what you're going to see is, I think, a narrowing of inequality. One of the striking features of the pandemic has been the resilience of American business. when the pandemic struck, one of my biggest concerns was that we would have millions and millions of bankruptcies, a wave of bankruptcies that would have led to the closure of otherwise productive and profitable businesses, businesses that were doing just fine in February of 2020, in the summer of 2020, closing their doors. And we haven't seen that. In part, that's due to public policy, the Paycheck Protection Program that supported businesses, government income transfers to households that allowed for consumer demand to stay strong despite the pandemic. But I think a lot of that really has to do with the resiliency and the creativity of businesses. And we all see this in our lives. A restaurant quickly converts to preparing dinners that people can heat up at home and that are still good to eat and that attract people. A restaurant figures out how to turn the parking lot into an outdoor seating area. Similar types of adaptation for non-restaurants, of course, to the point where business closures actually were below where they were prior to the pandemic. This is a story of the success of the bottom half of the wage distribution. The businesses that are adapting so well are not exclusively or even mostly Fortune 500 juggernauts. These are smaller mom and pop type shops. And the reason that that they've been so resilient is because of the workers who work there, who again are not millionaires by any stretch. And so, when I look at the pandemic, at the period we've been in, I see a big success story, and not just for people at the top.
So let's set aside though the pandemic for a second though, and talk about the long-term changes in the American economy to the extent that and the extent to which they relate to the rise of populism.
So I think Fiona is right to draw an analogy between what happened in the north of England and deindustrialization there, and what's happened to the Rust Belt in the United States. I don't know enough about the British economy to know whether that analogy extends to recent decades. But in the United States, something that gets lost a lot in this debate. If you look and a study that came out just before the pandemic, about a year before, actually from the Brookings Institution, took a look at local areas that were really heavily invested in manufacturing in 1970, and said, how are those doing? How are those doing now? What they found is that about 2/3 successfully transitioned to other industries. And so, yes, technological advancement, international trade, globalization did deindustrialize a lot of the United States. But the norm by the last few years, at least, the norm was for those industries to successfully transition away from manufacturing and toward other industries. And about 1 in 5 of those local areas were classified as strong in terms of the success of that transition by the Brookings study. So that's not 100 out of 100, right? I mean, there are certainly still parts of the United States that are suffering from deindustrialization, but the norm is a successful transition, not some sort of stagnation. Again, I'm not sure if that's true for Northern England as well, but that has been the case in the United States. And I had mentioned, Brent, when you asked me to comment on Fiona and Kori's discussion, that I think there's a similar dynamic at play in economic life. The United States has a high tolerance for risk, has a pretty remarkable ability to kind of turn on a dime and engage in real transformation, and that is driven by people, not by places. It's driven by entrepreneurs. It's driven by workers, and so there is, I think, a real question about whether or not the right thing to do for some of these places that have been left behind is to invest in those places, or to invest in people who can help transform those places into economic centers for activity that is more valuable in an economic sense than manufacturing.
This is and this is actually for any of the three of you to respond to, but it struck me when Kori was talking that about the speed with which stuff happens in America, and the turbulence of the American system relates to the risk tolerance, and I'm curious, and this is kind of an American-centric view, but has populism advanced more rapidly in the United States because of who we are as a people and our sort of our cultural habits of engagement? And Kori, I don't know if you want to see, you came off mute, so you must want to say something.
Yeah, I do. I thought about this question a lot when I was writing Safe Passage, because we project backwards a similarity in Anglo-American culture that doesn't exist until about 1870. And it doesn't exist until Britain democratizes much more fully than it had in most of the 19th century. That when the British describe democracy in America, they're horrified. It's exactly what they want to prevent Britain from becoming. It looks volatile. It looks corrupt. They believe most people are too ignorant to be able to vote their own interests, and easily manipulated by corrupt, particularly in urban areas, corrupt politicians. And Americans looking at Britain think they're stultifyingly afraid of letting people actually advance their own interests. So the fears they have of each other are sort of mirror images of each other. You don't begin to see similarities until several things happen. First, the American Civil War, right? The end of the hypocrisy of a democracy that is slaveholding in 2/3 of its territories. Lifts a huge burden off of Britain. But again, this whole frontiersman taking over the country stuff is also really uncomfortable for the British. And you see, there's a book about the decline of English industrial spirit by Margaret Thatcher's favorite British historian. And he tracks culturally, educationally, economically, the way Britain, as the 19th century progresses, even the industrialists who changed the world with the Industrial Revolution, there's such strong cultural resonance to retiring to being a landholding lord. And there's just not an equivalent for that in the United States. And the other thing that you get in the United States, you do get whitewashing of robber barons like Leland Stanford, right? Who are major economic engines, but also, not forces for positive change. But the means by which they whitewash their reputation are to create educational institutions, to create cultural institutions. And the only one that felt similar to me that I experienced in Britain is John Soane, the architect, who, you know, gets to become an architect because as a child, he's working for his father, carving stone or something, and a famous architect sees him. He creates a museum that's full and accessible because he wants other kids to have the opportunity to claw their way past restrictions. Very much the kind of resonance of Fiona's excellent book. So I think it's a complicated story, and we tend to make it either racial in retrospect, the similarities of Anglo-American culture that the racialists of the late 19th century construct, but which are not the experience actually of the history of it, right? Who's the country with whom the United States has rejected the most treaties? It's Britain. And it's because a combination of Irish Americans and, you know, hot-headed rebellionists prevent them.
So,
can I just kind of come in just to
yes, please.
Things, yeah, because, you know, I feel like actually we kind of sometimes a bit talking at kind of cross purposes, because the vantage point of the book is really of, you know, kind of what Michael might refer to as the other 1/3 who haven't made the successful transition. And from, you know, being from that kind of origin myself, I can just tell you it feels very different to be at the micro level than it does at the macro level. And so, you know, the purpose of the book is try to figure out how indeed that 1/3 who didn't make the successful transition can actually do it. How do you get away the barriers? And Michael, you were touching upon that when you were talking about investing in people or places. And Kori, you're, you know, referencing in the United Kingdom an awful lot of the fact that all of those barriers are still locked in. In the UK, it's very much locked in terms of class and region, regional disparities, but that actually happens in the United States as well, different kinds of barriers. But, you know, if you're in, you know, some kind of remote part of the old, you know, the Rust Belt, what used to be the old heartland, your barriers to entry into this kind of more successful America may be far greater, you know, than others in other parts of the country in terms of educational opportunities for loans, you know, for a small business, opportunities for changing your circumstances, you know, for example. And if you're born, you know, and are raised in a place that has lost the mainstay of its economy, and, you know, the kind of the manufacturing base is gone, do you really have the ability to move to go to somewhere else? This is kind of part of the thing that I'm unpacking in the book. In the United States, I'm always amazed actually by the amount of qualifications that don't go across state lines, for example. And you have to kind of retool and requalify. That's nuts. I mean, okay, the United Kingdom is a small place, but the absence of a larger healthcare system, some of these people shackled to their jobs or destitute, the absence of a kind of nationwide qualifications and, you know, kind of basically credentialing are also major barriers. And my point in the pandemic was that it accelerated things that, Michael, that you said rightly, you know, when I was writing it, of course, I mean, I finished it some time ago and it had to kind of go out and it looked pretty dire from the vantage point that I was sitting in when I was finishing up writing. It accelerated a lot of things that you rightfully pointed out happened with the Great Recession. So an awful lot of people found the value of their house disappeared. Rental properties are soaring in terms of pricing in various places. People, you know, foreclosed on their home and their cars. You know, they go into massive debt trying to retool themselves and, you know, requalify for different positions. And, you know, another, you know, Brookings study by my colleague, Bill Frey, you know, shows that we're less mobile in the United States than any time since World War II in terms of people's ability to move across the country. So some people are stuck in these places where the public goods, you know, the basic transportation infrastructure, the schools, you know, have all disappeared and fallen down because of the tax base. And so, you know, the purpose of the book is to try to do a debate, you know, exactly on the topics that you're all talking about, all of the areas that you work in, to figure out how we can unleash that potential for those 1/3 of Americans or people in the 1/3 of the places that didn't make that successful transition from, you know, the past set of transitions, because we're on the verge, we're right in the middle of another one. Acceleration of, you know, teleworking, we're all doing that right now. You know, battery electric operated, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, moving away into something of a more green economy. But it'll be a long transition from hydrocarbons. But, Joe Manchin's coal workers of West Virginia, been there, done that. From my perspective, those coal jobs are not going to stay and they're not going to come back in the way. So how do we figure out how to give, the people like my father who got no chance to, retool in somewhere, doing it on their own terms? Get them to be able to sort of choose what they want to do, because it's incredibly, of course, dispiriting when somebody comes and says you've got to be retrained. It sounds, kind of pretty negative, and also, sort of affront to your dignity. But to give people the wherewithal that they can have the entrepreneurial spirit themselves. I think my dad and others around him would have loved to set up their own business. Zero assets. In my hometown, the small businesses did close because there was no spending power. I mean, everybody was suddenly out of work, all at once. And I always think about Margaret Thatcher, who talked about, everyone should be like her dad, the grocer. Well, if all of her father's customers had lost their jobs and didn't have any money, the grocery store would have gone out of business. They did in my town. Basically, in some cases, multi-generational small businesses either, shrunk down to the smallest possible, or they actually went out of business after 150, 200, years of being in operation, because nobody had any money to spend. So, those are just, some of the quick points that I wanted to make, because it's really kind of figuring out how do we unleash those animal spirits and everyone else by getting rid of the kind of barriers and thinking practically about how to give them a hand up, not a handout, but a chance to be able to do what other people did as well. And I think it's investing in people, the kind of thing, Brent, that you do, and think about that. But it also has to be some investment in places as well to get some of the basic infrastructure in place that people are not going to be able to leave.
Yes, I think one of the challenges of writing a book is that at some point you have to stop writing it.
Yes.
I certainly agree with your characterization of the early part of the pandemic, and then that's when you turn the manuscript in, and I think the kind of pace of the recovery has been much faster than anybody expected, and arguably that is healthy. I think you're right to focus on the 1/3. One of the challenges with this debate in the United States is that we don't only focus on the 2/3, but we focus on the 1% of that 2/3 that's the worst off. And one of the aspects of our populist moment that I find most concerning is a tendency to confuse our biggest problems with our kind of normal national experience. Listening to populists in either political party, you would think that every town was the town that's the worst off. You would think that every person was a 55-year-old manufacturing worker who got laid off 5 years ago and can't get back on his feet. And one of the things I've tried to do in my work in recent years is say, hey, we have real problems. That 1/3 is a problem, but that's not the norm. And let's try and accurately characterize what's happened to typical communities, the typical American workers, the typical households. I do think that Fiona, you in your opening remarks tried to draw a distinction between the kind of overall economy and particular industries or areas that were left behind. And Margaret Thatcher worked for everybody, but Margaret Thatcher worked on the whole, let's say, but Margaret Thatcher didn't work for everybody, and Margaret Thatcher didn't work for every place. Of course, I agree with that. I think that a relatively unregulated market economy does work on the whole, but does produce some outcomes for particular individuals or groups of individuals or communities that we may not find optimal. But I think the answer is not a different set of policies for those people or those places. The solution to the 1/3 of zip codes or counties that haven't recovered from deindustrialization, I think, is more dynamism. It is more a greater willingness to change, a greater willingness to adapt, a greater willingness to retrain, a greater willingness among individuals to move. And I think the debate over populism gets this exactly backwards. Dynamism works on the whole, but for these towns in Pennsylvania, it doesn't work. So no dynamism for them. But I think the right policy prescription is exactly the opposite. I think we need more dynamism for them. The problem is they haven't been dynamic enough. And some of the policy solutions that you're talking about, I think, advance what could be characterized as greater dynamism. Workers changing occupations, changing industries, allowing workers from other states, making it easier for them to move to these communities by making sure they don't have to go through an entirely new set of credentialing programs or licensing requirements. I think encouraging people to move. You are correct to point to the low rate of geographic mobility in the United States. One of the major ways that the U.S. economy reached equilibrium after recessions in previous decades has simply been people packing up the car and moving to a place with better job opportunities. We don't do that anymore, at least not nearly as much as we used to in the United States. That's a big problem. And figuring out how to help people to be more willing to do that, I think, is a potentially very promising avenue. And so, I think it's important because it illustrates this broader problem with populism. Where you see it in, one of our political parties wants to go back to the 1950s and the other one wants to go back to the 1930s. The solution is in the future, not in the past.
Yeah.
And that's true for two reasons. One is just very practical. We aren't going to reindustrialize, and so those 1/3 of places that haven't recovered from deindustrialization, the solution simply isn't more industrialization. And so Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and all these politicians that want to use industrial policy to reindustrialize, it's just not going to work. Even if we could pass the laws won't be effective. What's really needed is a faster march toward the future for those places, not a rapid retreat to the past.
Fiona, did you want to respond?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And, as I say, the focus in the book is on education. It's on, kind of expanding opportunity. I mean, I use this term, the infrastructure of opportunity, which is, everything that goes into, giving people that ability to move. Now, it might be a socioeconomic move in a certain context, in an urban area where there are more opportunities. In other words, it might be geographic mobility. The only thing is that not everyone can do that. And I do think that there's a lot of things that have happened during the pandemic. I mean, as you have already said, Michael, that it's been a faster recovery. Some of it's been the interventions that we've, instituted to help prop up businesses, to give them kind of loans to tide them over. Child credit actually did make a big difference for an awful lot of families. I want to say that as somebody who had the similar benefit in the UK growing up, that was essential for my family for keeping us off the poverty line. I mean, one of the biggest problems is women falling out of the workplace. I mean, the one thing, and some of the biggest blows have happened to women who, have been hit not just by the changes in the workplace during the pandemic, but obviously all the closures of schools and out of school facilities, and they've been really hard hit. We're going to have to think about how to bring women back into the workforce. There's been I think now some of the statistics suggest it's gone back to the 1970s. So there may have to be some short-term interventions that may try to get people back on their feet again, but again looking forward into the ways in which we might address this. I mean, the one part of notwithstanding the great breakthroughs and successes in vaccines and everything else, but the healthcare system has not held up. And I will just say again, because I was somebody who came in from the outside, the healthcare system, even though I've been living here in the United States since 1989, remains baffling. Even for somebody with multiple degrees, I can never figure out what the hell I'm paying for when I have any kind of medical procedure, and I live in absolute dread of any kind of encounter with the US emergency systems and everything else. And there are ways to fix this without, kind of getting into all of the freak out about socialized medicine. The British National Health Service, problematic as it is today too, because it's certainly ground to a halt, as well as I know from dealing with my mother in the UK right now and all kinds of problems that she's been having. But it was initially set up on the basis of a whole host of private as well as charitable institutions, and a lot of those remained. So, and it doesn't have to be one size fits all. And Stuart Butler, who used to be at AEI and now over at Brookings, has come up along with many others about different ideas in which you might tailor this. This is one thing that I think would actually increase people's mobility, both socioeconomic mobility and geographic mobility, because people are shackled to their health insurance. It's absolutely nuts if you start to think about it. It's not in terms of putting forward something for the future, but pulling people back into the past and constraining their options. So there are some things in there that we might, need to figure out how to tackle. Not again, by the government doing it overall. And I have a fear, in fact, of the government getting involved too much. There was a part of the book that I talked about, some of the demands for a Marshall Plan. And Brent, I think I had pointed that out. In the discussion, we had a letter from several mayors from Appalachia, from Ohio and Michigan, and various other players who put that on the map as an idea for the revitalization of their communities. And I, in the book, expanded on this a little bit to think about the original Marshall Plan was this big infusion of funds for recovery, and we've been talking about pandemic recovery here, Michael. I think you've talked about some of the issues. I've seen some of your commentary on this. It's one thing to just spur recovery, but it's also then to think about, longer term development. What kind of money would you want to kind of use from public funds? Infrastructure, we've been talking about that, obviously fixing roads and bridges. I mean, after some of these collapses of bridges out in Pennsylvania, everything, we can see our infrastructure needs fixing, broadband or, connectivity issues. I mean, these are one thing. But the other thing is really trying to get communities and towns, municipalities themselves to figure out how they're going to revitalize themselves. I think that kind of gets to your point, Michael, about thinking to the future. We shouldn't go back to the past. You don't want to go back and rebuild the old infrastructure. I also kind of think, if we're thinking about the infrastructure bill, some of those bridges might not need to be restored. Some of them might have been going to old workplaces. In the United Kingdom, for example, all of our trains and rails either went to London, which is a bit like going to Moscow in the Soviet Union days, or they went to, work sites. They weren't kind of linking up small towns and, villages for commerce sometimes. And I mean, that's kind of, maybe we have an opportunity to do something different. I don't like the slogan, build back better. How about building forward? So if we're thinking about using public money, what's the best use to put this to? That's not just nationwide, but also tailored, to thinking about how different communities, as well as different states and, regions and municipalities might want to think to the future, not back to the past.
So this raises the question that I wanted to ask from my perspective, which is, and you've been pretty clear, Fiona, that you don't think government, you're wary of too much government involvement in this, but government does have a role in your framework that you lay out in the book. Describe that role. What is the right role for government? You talk about something like we have a Department of Homeland Security. Do we need a Department of Homeland Investment? That kind of, or an office within the White House that's looking at coordinating investment. What makes you think that you get good allocations of investment out of that kind of approach?
I was thinking about it, something more like a clearinghouse of I worked at the National Intelligence Council, which was kind of a sort of a clearinghouse for intelligence. And I think, we would all be, the first to say that sometimes when we create these departments of Homeland Security, departments of national intelligence, for example, the Director of National Intelligence, they metastasize. they always kind of get much bigger than you envisage. And I think there's a lot of risk in that we would constantly having to be, looking at and thinking about in more flexible terms. But, one of my models is actually when I was working for the Eurasia Foundation, for example, which was looking at grant making, still is there, in the former Soviet Union. And it acted more as a clearinghouse, best practices, trying to kind of pull together monies that were already there, but really working with the communities for them to come up with ideas. I mean, it turns out, and I mean, you and Michael, obviously pretty aware of this, there's already an enormous amount of money that's been allocated across the federal government, or by, congressional bills and legislation that's all over the place. And, I mentioned in the book the work of one of my colleagues at Brookings, Tony Pipper, who was looking at rural development, which has become a buzzword in, the United States as well. And he discovered that, the money for rural development is just all over the place. Half the time we don't even know what's there for various fundings. So, in part, I mean, again, this is an idea that's thrown out there to be picked apart and attacked by people so we can come up with something better. It's an idea of how can we streamline and how can we kind of more better allocate some of the funding that's already there. I always think that public-private partnerships work the best. I mean, when I look at some of the success stories that Michael was referring to in municipalities, they're often of these local development enterprise councils or committees or commissions or agencies that have been set up, and they always work best when they have the local government, state and municipal, as well as the private sector, working together. And they, do often have entities that operate like these clearinghouses. So, I mean, it may be, using that kind of model, maybe on the federal level as well, but not creating some stultifying, new bureaucracy that then builds, new buildings and, masses of people on board, because we need something, more flexible. But I do think, I'm not sure that the White House has the bandwidth to be able to do this, because, part of the message that I also say in the book is that, the federal government changes over all the time. That's what Kori was talking about. I mean, we're constantly changing over our federal government and bringing new people in. We can turn on a dime. But often local and regional issues have a much larger, longer period that requires for transformation. So, we've got to find that kind of balance there, because the kinds of things that, Michael's been writing about, since the Great Recession, which have really, been spurred off by local dynamism, they've had consistency. I mean, you don't really have, the kind of whole state and local government changing over with quite the rapidity that you do in at the federal level. So it's really kind of a question of trying to figure out what would be the, the best balance of this. I think there's an incredible role for philanthropy, for example, of private institutions like universities, working with local communities as well. But, in the book, I talk a lot about private entrepreneurship and private effort that's kind of related to this. And working within a frame where there could be, some and should be some funding from the public sector.
Kori's been waiting very patiently to ask a question, and then we've got several questions, probably more questions than I've ever gotten before from people who are watching. So go ahead, Kori.
So I loved the part of the book where you talk about the populist moment right now in Britain and in the US, right? The similar feel of a lot of the Trumpism to the Brexit phenomenon in Britain. And I'd like to ask you to say a little bit about that. One of my very favorite comments about my native land of California comes from Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "When I am in California, I do not feel like I am in the West. California is the West of the West." And I have been wondering in this populist moment whether Britain and the United States, because of who we are culturally, are the West of the West right now. That is, are the struggles that we are seeing with governance in Britain and in the United States the precursor to things we are going to see in Canada, in Germany, in other places? Or is there something unique to what's going on in the US and Britain at this moment, Fiona?
Well, it's interesting because Canada's suddenly, kind of turning in slightly different direction with the truckers in Ottawa, though I think that's obviously we're kind of watching that dynamic there. I think actually that this populist upsurge has been happening in many different places with similar sorts of roots, but obviously with very different manifestations because of the culture that you point out. And in the UK and the US, there's a lot of similarity, but there's a lot of dissimilarities as well. And Germany is actually very interesting because the Germans also looked like they were on a populist track. The emergence of, on the right, the Alternative for Deutschland. They've always had a far left as well, Linke, and which, as you know, I mean, Kori, often had a bit of an upsurge in German politics as well. And Germany's, had not just the history, from World War II, obviously, but a history of political violence, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and kind of other phenomenon that we've seen there. But the recent election has put Germany on, potentially, we'll have to see what happens, on a different path. They've got a three-way coalition, for the very first time. They have a chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who ran on a platform of respect. And they're also going to actually try to address this very question of left behind places and people and inequality that has emerged in Germany over the last several decades. Because in many respects, over the last 30 years after unification of Germany, they've not really knit the East back fully into the West. There's still quite a lot of socioeconomic discrepancy. They've had a lot of immigration, so that's kind of changed the whole profile of German politics. And then they've still got the old historic divides among the various regions, that go north-south, not just east-west, and different perspectives. But there's also some really interesting things that have happened in Germany in the old industrial heartland. And I was recently on a Zoom with the European Parliament, where they brought in one of the members from the Ruhr, from Essen, which is a very similar part of Germany to the northeast of England. And in fact, is part of the same giant coal field that extends of northern Germany under the North Sea and into Britain. So Essen's one part of the coal field, and the northeast of England, where I grew up, was the other end. And they have transformed themselves quite successfully, in the way that Michael was, talking about the sort of 2/3 of the places in the United States from their industrial transition, from being, very similar to the northeast of England in the 1980s. And it's been a combination of entrepreneurship, private entrepreneurship at home, but also quite a bit of municipal, regional, and government state, German state money, and European Union sort of structural funds. And it's been a bit of a heavy lift. But what's also interesting there is they have these workers' collectives, and this is where it gets into the populism, where they've given the workers full participation in the decision-making. They have, these societies, workers' societies, associations. They're not actually labour unions, but as societies. And this is kind of where I want to kind of get us around. We're seeing a really interesting development here in the United States at the moment that could just well take the edge off that populism, which is this upsurgence of interest in alternative labour movements. I mean, obviously, trade unionism in the United States and in the United Kingdom is its lowest period. But look, we're getting, research assistants at Brookings forming a union and being, I think, part of the auto workers union, which kind of blew my mind actually thinking about that. I don't know whether AI research assistants and interns have done that, but, baristas at Starbucks.
Mike's in charge of breaking that up.
There you are. But it's really about people finding a voice, because what is populism? It's about kind of people not being able to sort of find their voice and somebody else taking the voice for them. The Trumpism, the Farageism, Boris Johnson and others, kind of in the United Kingdom. And people are really, and this gets back to, all of your points here, as individuals, they want to have a voice though collectively, and they're trying to find a way of doing this. And in the German society, they basically give people a voice in different forms of representation at different kinds of levels. And in the US and UK, we've moved away from that. I'm not saying bring back trade unions, but I do talk about in the book about the forerunner of the miners' union in the United Kingdom, which was the Durham Miners Association, other miners' associations that were regionally focused. And they're very interesting. So my great-grandfather was one of the spokesmen of the Durham Miners Association. And with their dues, it wasn't just all about, kind of pay or, issues about workers' safety, although it was important early on, but it was also about giving miners and their families the best possible opportunity. And they had all of these, with their dues, they paid for these welfare societies. Again, welfare, well-being. There's a big theme about well-being in the UK now, where people are looking about how that might change, some of the different perspectives and take the edge off populism by having these well-being and, different indicators. Carol Graham, my colleague at Brookings, and many other people are working on that. And it's becoming a bit of a thing in the United States, but hasn't really taken off so much. But the whole idea was of mutual support, mutual assistance, and ideas of encouraging people to think about their mutual prosperity, and the societies helped for education of the miners and their kids, and also giving them different opportunities. And so that's kind of really the sort of German ethos in some of the regions, and that's what had helped really in the Ruhr. And I think that there's a desire for this that's emerging in the United States as well. It's not just about workers' conditions and pay and benefits, but it's also about people wanting educational opportunities, wanting to remove the barriers. Starbucks, the baristas and their, union and individual places. Starbucks also has this really interesting corporate education program where, people are doing degrees at the same time at ASU, Arizona State University, for example. I mean, people want to improve their position. And that's kind of perhaps what's the missing thing, Michael, in some of the jobs and, the recovery, is people wanting some kind of benefits, not just health benefits, which I think need to be addressed, but it's also that ability to improve their educational and training prospects to be able to move up and to do something else. And I think that that's something that kind of might take the edge off populism. Sorry, I'm talking too long here, but apologies.
No, you're great. But I want to throw this question into the mix, because I think it gets to, this is from one of the people who are watching, because it gets to the question of, who's really the agent here in this conversation? Is it the government? Is it business? Is it the individual? What is it? And so one of the questions that just got asked is, how does the government invest in left behind places if those left behind places resist government intervention? Which I think is a very interesting way of phrasing the question of how so much of the agency involved here in terms of personal agency is actually now directed against the effort to any kind of coordinated government effort to assist the left behind. So I'm just going to throw that out there and ask if anybody has any thoughts.
Well, I'd be interested in Michael as well as Kori's view on this, because it depends on how that's done, right?
Yeah, I don't think they would.
In America, don't know, for example, that small business loans come from the government. So it depends on how it's administered. If you had some great big overbearing entity, that might be one thing. But if it's, kind of made accessible through, small business loans or something else. I mean, Michael, you were talking already about that recovery in the pandemic, and obviously government assistance has been crucial to some degree in that.
Yeah, get your government hands off my Medicare. I think that government assistance would be welcome everywhere. This kind of gets into the nuts and bolts of how you would do this sort of thing. But the way that you would do it would be, it would largely be invisible to the people who actually live there. I mean, you could have a special tax rate for business activity that's located in a particular zip code, as a way to encourage businesses to locate activity in a region that's been left behind. You could have an earnings subsidy that is more generous for people in a particular zip code or a particular county. That's the kind of thing where the IRS would, do that calculation, or you, the individual, might do it, but you would do it once a year at tax time. Presumably, that would boost workforce participation among people who live in that county or in that zip code. It might encourage some in-migration. You might have a federal government grant to a local government to support physical infrastructure development, for example. But it's hard for me to imagine any of that being rejected. I mean, there have been, and perhaps this is what the questioner is referring to, there have been governors of red states who wanted to opt out, for example, of the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion, or who wanted to opt out of pandemic era unemployment benefits. But these are kind of very high profile, politicized situations that I think would be very, very, very different than the kinds of investments in left behind communities that
Well, I think it's almost even more of a cultural question than it is about the economics or the who doesn't want a subsidy question. The very name that you just used, the left behind counties. Who wants to be one of the left behind counties? Why are you talking about
better branding, right, Brent?
Yeah.
I mean, my read of it is that quite a few seem to, more seem to than probably deserve it. I mean, this is the rhetoric that got President Trump elected. This is the rhetoric that candidates for the U.S. Senate in some of these Rust Belt states for the Republican nomination in their state are using. Boris Johnson has just created a leveling up secretary, and so I don't see a lot of resistance to that.
The department. We need a department of leveling up. It sounds like. I know that. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Fiona. What was that?
No, I just said leveling up is the strangest term. I keep thinking about the Department of Silly Walks from Monty Python or something like that, leveling up. Because what's the level? I mean, it doesn't really convey what you're trying to do. Anyway.
I know that at least Kori needs to go, and I'm sure that everybody else is busy too. So I wanted to thank you, all of you, for taking some time out to talk about this. Fiona, thank you again for your work on the book. It's fascinating, I think, and provocative, and helps us to sort of reset the frame of the way that we think about this. Yes, Mike's got his copy right there, and I see one in the background with Fiona. So again, thanks, Kori and Mike, and especially Fiona, for taking time out of your day today to be with us.
No, I really appreciate it, and I was very excited to be able to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. And I know that people at AEI are thinking about all of these topics all the time, and hopefully we'll come up with some good answers to some of these issues. But thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
I am actually struck, both reading the book and in this conversation, at how much common ground there is for addressing these problems. So thank you for that reminder, Fiona, Mike, and Brent.
Yep. Okay, everybody, have a great day and a great week.
Thank you.